We're so lucky to have Kaley here this afternoon. As you may have seen in my email, she just released the new book, The 80-80 Marriage. Here it is. And it was just selected as the New York Times Editor's Choice. So Kaley, congratulations and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, I know one of the reasons that I was interested in doing this topic right now is just because I think that, man, relationships are hard these days, a year into COVID. And I'm wondering if you are seeing that in your work as well.
Absolutely. It's actually been really striking that in COVID, what we saw is a magnification or an amplification of the dynamics that were present in many marriages. So, in some ways, it was one of those, if there were things that you really appreciated about your partner, you got to experience them more often, and that was delightful. But it's also really revealed some things that were like maybe little cracks have really been exposed. And even more than that, we're not used to spending 24/7 with our partners. And so having very little space from one another has also created dynamics where a lot of things that we thought we knew before, so what our roles were pre-pandemic, what our agreements were pre-pandemic, those have all been renegotiated. And so it's actually created a lot of pressure in relationships. That was a bit, I don't know if I would say surprising, but certainly unprecedented.
Well, the timing is pretty amazing for the launch of the book. I mean, I'm assuming that you wrote the book before, but help us understand why you wrote the book.
Yeah, so the beginning of the book was written before, and interestingly, we turned in our first draft of the final copy the week after the whole world shut down. All of our kids were sent home from school. So I would say that it has been pressure tested in this environment in a way that was pretty intense. But the reason that we initially wrote the book is because we were looking for a guide to help us in this modern context. There are some phenomenal marriage resources already out there for you guys based in Seattle. John Gottman and the Gottman Institute is wonderful, emotional centered therapy. But what we couldn't find was somebody who was talking about, okay, how do we navigate this world where we carry supercomputers around in our pockets? We are all extremely busy. We're navigating a space where now more than ever, we're seeing both partners and relationships who are working outside the home. And so, gosh, how do we navigate this space? And when we went looking, my husband and I were like, maybe we're doing something wrong. So we went out and we interviewed over 100 people. And what we were really interested in was finding what were the couples who were thriving, doing differently, and were there any patterns that we could find in couples in this modern context who were finding things more challenging. And based on that, could we find strategies, tools, exercises that could help all of us look a lot more like those couples that are thriving?
Hmm. Well, help us understand what the 80-80 concept is.
Yeah. So what we found in these interviews is that one of the through lines is that couples in the modern context both felt like, hey, we are equals and we want to be in love. How do we do that? And the initial technology was kind of clunky. It was, okay, we're equals. We should just make everything fair. We should make it 50-50. And that ended up causing a ton of problems because as soon as you're striving to reach just perfect evenness, it ends up creating a mindset of scorekeeping. If I do this one thing, then you do that one thing. And that's particularly problematic because marriage is almost impossible to measure in that way. So, for instance, our daughter had a nightmare a couple nights ago. So I got up in the middle of the night and I'm the one comforting her. Well, if I'm in a fairness mindset, like how many loads of laundry does my husband need to fold in order to make up for one night of comforting a nightmare? Like you can't, the math doesn't work. So the big idea with 80-80 is just to shift the mindset. How are we relating to our partners? So we completely drop scorekeeping and instead strive to contribute 80%. Then we realize the math makes absolutely no sense. And that's kind of the point, that love and math, they don't necessarily need to make sense. It's that in the attempt to contribute 80%, in the mindset of radical generosity, whether or not we make it to sort of overshooting the mean, it creates a really different flavor in the relationship where we feel like a team.
Do you think that this applies to friendships or coworkers or just, of course, love partners, not necessarily your spouse?
Yeah. So any form of intimate relationship, 100%. So marriage in some ways is a foil that in our world, love is love. And so if you are striving to create a life together, these principles apply. I love the extension of what does this look like in friendship? And my best friend and I just walked the other day and we were actually having a conversation that sometimes it can actually almost feel easier in a friendship than it does in an intimate marriage. That this idea, though, with a friend is can you also arrive with that mindset of radical generosity? And sort of a funny story, very early in our friendship, both my best friend and I had little ones. They were, I don't know, like 2 or 3 months old. And it just so happened that every time we went to this new friend's house at that time, my daughter decided that she would blow through several diapers and I would end up borrowing from this friend. And so one time, sort of trying to be thoughtful, trying to kind of, help out, I brought her a package of diapers. And she looked at me and she was like, oh no, that is not the kind of friendship that we're going to have. And I said, what do you mean? And she was like, I never want to have to worry that I've used a diaper. I never want to have to pay you back for $5. I don't want to have to remember your birthday. If I do, great. But I want there to be so much generosity and so much love between us that we're never keeping track of those things. And that has been the tenor. And that to me just so beautifully characterizes how these ideas translate over into friendship.
I mean, that's a great example. I do think that I've always strived for 50-50 relationships, and it does turn into kind of like a scorekeeping. Why not 100-100?
Yeah, great question. Well, so what we found when we interviewed these couples is that there were some couples who were trying to do 100. And the challenge is that in giving all of themselves to the relationship, they actually let go of having any part of themselves that was just their goals, just their dreams. And there was a gentleman who we interviewed who I thought he described this really well. He's like, I just kind of got on the bus of doing what I was supposed to do for our relationship. But I never paused to ask, what's my big dream? And in doing that, it actually sort of in giving 100%, he missed out on that piece that was for himself. So we sort of think that there's a meeting in the middle, that in 50-50 scorekeeping, it doesn't work. In 100-100, you actually lose yourself, which is problematic in a different way.
Right.
But with 80-80, right, the idea is to give, is to appreciate, is to reveal from this mindset of radical generosity, and is to align your values and to align your priorities with your partner so that there's a sense of shared success. So it's not 50-50, one person wins and one person loses, but rather this sense of how do we come together? How do we bring our dreams together so that we're pointed in the same direction and so that it feels like we win together?
That's beautiful. Well, what are some classic 50-50 fairness fights?
Yeah. So one of the things that I thought was so interesting is that in these interviews, if you asked people just outright, hey, do you ever fight about fairness? Most people would say no. They're like, no, that's not really what we fight about. And so it was only through the stories that we started to really see this through line. So there's actually some interesting, I'll share just a few faces of fairness that we saw over and over again. So one of them was in the domestic domain. So this was sort of what we talked about where it's, I canceled a meeting to be here for the cable guy. The least that you could do is carpool. Or this one, actually, the friends and extended family fight is the one that my husband and I fell into a lot early in our marriage, where it was this sense of we need to spend the exact same amount of time with each of our families. And one of my most favorite interviews was this couple where they were dividing Mother's Day and Father's Day. And so her family got Mother's Day weekend and his family got Father's Day weekend. And that was a perfect 50-50 fair agreement. But then had this fascinating fight where he came to her and he was like, hey, so for Mother's Day, I was thinking, what if we leave on Saturday and come back on Sunday? But when we go Father's Day to my house, it just really makes more sense if we leave on Friday and come back on Sunday. And in the interview, we were talking to the wife in this marriage, and she was like, here's the kicker. I was infuriated that he would suggest a timeline that wasn't fair, even though that's what I actually wanted. So there's sort of this funny, like, hey, we want to spend exactly the same amount of time. The money fight shows up around fairness if there's one person who's more devoted to spending or to saving and someone comes in with a purchase. So this one will sound a lot like, wait a second, I can't believe that you just upgraded your computer. And the person on the other side says, well, I had to, it was for work. And it's really this notion of what's fair in terms of how we allocate our family resources. And then the last one, the free time fight, is also a place where stories just abounded. I would love to hear from folks in the chat if you see any of these faces of fairness, or if you have different ones that show up. So my husband and I were being interviewed. We were on a podcast, and our interviewer showed up and had sort of this 9-week-old baby on his chest. And he was like, hey, I'm so sorry. My wife had a really important meeting, so the baby's going to join us for the interview. We were like, that's great. It's the Zoom world. There's a lot of grace here. And he was telling us a story that he was reading the 80-80 Marriage in preparation for our interview. He's like, and my wife walked by and saw me reading the book. And she was like, are you kidding? You have time for reading now? So he's like, no, it's for work. So what was really interesting about these was seeing that fairness on its face was really what people said, but it was all the different ways that it showed up that people started to report. And that was kind of this through line where we started to recognize fairness is really, it's just a clunky technology. It's a good aspiration, right? The idea of like, we want it to be fair. Fairness in some ways is kind of a universal desire. The problem is it doesn't work. And it doesn't work for all these reasons. One of my favorite reasons it doesn't work is because we can't see what our partner isn't doing when we're not there. So Monica, I'm curious if you've seen this before, but it's like, I am intimately familiar with everything that I do. I know every trash can emptied. I know every, Zoom call that I was on with your family where I was delightful. But when it comes to how long it took to get our kids to online school and set up, real fuzzy, because that's what my husband was doing this morning.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's so easy to keep track of what you do in the positive column.
Yes.
Okay, so talk a little bit about shifting more to 80-80.
Yeah, so the big shift to 80-80 is letting go of that kind of trying to make it just even and really contributing more from this mindset of radical generosity. And so the image that we use is that in 50-50, everything is perfectly fair, right? It's sort of even in the circle. There's a belief that everything's a trade-off, that when I win, you lose, and when you win, I lose. Whereas in 80-80, everything kind of gets blown up, that it's sort of beyond what we can even measure. And really, there are 3 mindset shifts that lay the foundation to be able to shift to 80-80 and create a structure that really supports it. So the 3 shifts in mindset, one is about how you contribute. So if you're contributing from that score-keeping mentality, then everything I do, you owe me one. Whereas in 80-80, we say contribute from a space of generosity. Can I do it with a spirit of this is a gift? It's a gift to you. It's a gift to our relationship. The second is really about appreciation. And I think about this as the glasses that you wear in your relationship. And it was Easter at our house on Sunday, and we did a scavenger hunt and, looking for the eggs. And that reminded me of marriage from the perspective that when we go on a scavenger hunt, we find what we're looking for. And so if in our marriage, I go looking for all the ways that my partner fell short or all the ways that my loved one let me down, I will find them. Whereas if I put on glasses of appreciation and I go looking for all the ways that my partner is amazing, and I go looking for all the gifts that they give me in our relationship, I find those too. And if I'm able to articulate it, if I'm able to say thank you, it makes a huge difference in how our relationship feels.
Mm.
So contribute generously, wear the glasses of appreciation. And then the third is about revealing. And I think about revealing sort of in two different forms. One is stuff happens in marriage. We get rubbed the wrong way, something lands funny, something does become, an argument of some sort. And to be able to reveal, gosh, I was really upset when I was signed up for this event that I didn't know was coming. Or to be able to say, like, hey, it really hurts my feelings when you talk about me in front of your family that way. That's the kind of revealing that keeps little tiny disagreements or tiny misses from becoming something big. The second piece of revealing, though, is also about letting your partner know your inner world. That one of the things that we've been hearing a ton is that in this world where we spend sort of 24/7 in the same space, we're close, but we're not actually connected. And there was this great meme that I saw where it's two people at the end of a long day and they're having date night, which means they're sitting on the couch, not watching a movie, each like streaming their own Instagram or like reading their own Facebook feed. They're not having that conversation. They're not updating their sort of understanding of their partner. And so that's that third leg. Do I really know you? Are we asking each other good questions?
Mm. Well, okay, so say you decide that you want to go down this path of 80-80. How do you get your partner on board?
Yeah, it's a great question. So there are some partners where as soon as you offer this idea, you're like, hey, I heard this new way of doing marriage where instead of scorekeeping, it's about radical generosity. And your partner will be like, yes, read the book, you're done. But for people where you go, hey, this seems like a great idea, I want to try it. And they go, do I have to? I think that there's kind of a couple different ways in. One is really about inviting them in a way that feels friendly. So this was actually a fascinating surprise. I'm going to digress for a second and then we'll come back. So this is my fourth book. I've written primarily about leadership in the past, and it's my husband's third book, and he's written primarily about mindfulness. And in our prior books, no one ever said like, Kaley, you shouldn't write about leadership. People are going to scrutinize you. Or like to my husband, nobody said like, ooh, Nate, you really shouldn't write about mindfulness. You're going to lose your mind. But as soon as we started writing about marriage, people were like, I don't know, that's sort of the third rail. And people came out of the woodwork. They're like, Kaley, if you write about marriage, I had this friend, she was on a podcast talking about marriage and they got divorced. And it's sort of this warning of like, not only are you going to get divorced, people are going to laugh at you. But then there was this other thing that happened where 80-80 marriage would be on a bedside table and people would be like, and my partner started asking me like, are we okay? Should I worry? Which is also, again, it's so fascinating to me because if I were reading a parenting book, nobody would be asking like, are you thinking about maybe like dropping your kid and not parenting anymore? I was like, no. Or like a recipe book, like, so are you thinking about not eating? Like, of course not.
It's so funny. That is exactly what happened when I had the book on my counter and my husband said, do we have a problem that I don't know about? But it is kind of funny that your relationship is one of the most important things in life. And so to be proactive about trying to make it better, it's just kind of ironic. So was that one of the biggest surprises you experienced during the process of writing the book?
Completely. It was this huge surprise that being proactive about this absolutely intimate, essential, meaningful relationship could be framed as, uh-oh, it's a problem, rather than, oh my gosh, this is an investment. All of that to come back to, if you want to bring this up with your partner, I think that framing really matters. I love you. I care about you. I want us to be our best. I think that there are a couple exercises in this book that if we did them, gosh, we feel so busy. There's an
Mhm.
exercise in here that's about priorities. I think doing it together would help us feel more clear. Or, hey, gosh, it feels like we accidentally keep not being the top of each other's priority list. I wonder if there are some other things that we want to say no to. There's an exercise in here that I think could be really helpful for us in identifying that. Right. So framing it as, here are some things I think we could do together that would really help us address some of the things that likely we've complained about with each other. So if it feels like it's a solution, if it feels like it's an invitation, partners are much more likely to say, oh gosh, yeah, I'd like to read that with you. Or, oh gosh,
Mhm.
that exercise sounds compelling. If it feels scolding, where it's like, we have something wrong, it's probably you, read this book, then I don't know, I wouldn't read that book.
Mhm. But it also made me think of just good and bad questions. And there was a question from the audience about what are some examples of good and bad questions. And
Yeah.
I'm assuming that that is related to like the reveal and the request that you cover in the book. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, you bet. So it's not that there are bad questions. I think that there are questions that leave you on the surface. So I think, for instance, hey, how are you? Pretty reliably gets an answer that's some version of like, I'm fine, how are you? Right? Whereas asking a question that's more like, hey, when did you feel most loved by me in the last week? My guess is that question would sort of stop your partner in their tracks and they would have to go, huh, right? Which in some ways allows a little bit of inquiry. Or to ask a question in the proactive, hey, I'm not sure I've given you lots of TLC. What's a way that I can really show you how much I love you in the next week, or express how much I love you in the next week? Again, gives them an opportunity to give you some guidance. But that's a question that's unlikely to get a like, fine, how are you? Right. So it's about, how can we dig beneath the surface? How can we know each other more? I have often found that if you ask, how are you? And you get fine, how are you? It's interesting to ask, and so what's really going on with you? Because again, there's that sort of next layer of, oh, I haven't even given myself permission to pause and wonder about that. Thanks for asking, and thanks for being in that inquiry with me. That,
And so much so that happens with friendships too.
yes.
You
Yeah.
know, and so it does make me think. We recently had an event with a fabulous woman named Kat Velos on the topic of friendships, and we had an incredible turnout, and it's something that I think people are thinking about a lot right now. And so it really makes me think about the questions that you would ask your friends as well. And someone from the audience asked if there are different fights of fairness within friendships.
Yeah, I think that, some things within friendship aren't shared, which usually are in marriage or intimate relationships. So, for instance, it's unlikely that you and a good friend are going to fight about sex or are going to fight about money, whereas those are pretty common areas of complexity for married couples. With a friend, it's more likely around initiating connection. So if it feels like, hey, how come I'm always the one who texts you, or I'm always the one who calls you, or I'm always the one who hosts you? I think anytime there's always or never language is a real opportunity for a reveal and request. So this is a practice that we explore in quite a bit of depth in the 80/80 marriage, which is about being able to reveal your inner experience as a gift to the relationship. So, for instance, in a friendship, this might sound something like, hey, gosh, I noticed that when I text you 4, 5, 6 times and you don't initiate a conversation back, I start to feel like I care more than you do. And when I believe that, I hurt my own feelings. I feel really sad. right? And that creates an open dialogue for you with this friend to be able to understand, gosh, you're just a prolific texter. I've become used to responding. I'm so sorry that landed that way. Or to have a different conversation that says, hey, maybe I'm starting to feel a little bit smothered and I really want to prioritize my relationship with, we'll make up a story, my mom who's aging, and it feels like there's a competition between you. And that feels yucky that I'm always making trade offs, that someone's disappointed. That's an invitation to a really
Mm.
deep and significant conversation that won't happen if it's just like, well, you never call me.
Yeah. Okay. So, both with friendships and with your partner, is it good practice, and do you schedule time with your partner to have these conversations? Like the person that asked in the chat is, do you schedule family meetings to discuss issues?
Yeah, so there's sort of three answers to this question. So I think, yes, we definitely schedule time to make sure that we are in sync with each other. This sort of caveat where I would say it's sort of two answers to the same question is, in my intimate partnership, we're really intentional to separate logistics time from like date or intimate or
Mm.
connection time.
Ugh,
That,
so important.
right? If we're on date night and we're talking about like who's going to do drop off or what are we going to buy at Costco, it's just not that connecting. But both are really essential components of life. So we definitely do sort of a weekly tag up to make sure that we have all of our logistics connected. And we do our deep conversations on a hike. So we're the ones that you'll find out sort of rain, shine, sleet, snow. We're out on a trail reliably every Saturday morning for a couple hours to do that deeper check-in.
Hmm.
How are you really? What's truly going on with you? What are you dreaming about? What do you feel scared of? That connection time we know is there. Also, as sort of those micro incidents show up, sometimes we'll save them, that we know we're going to have a longer time to debrief and there's sort of a pattern at play that we want to explore. But most of the time, the reveal in the moment is sometimes even more powerful or more efficient, because I'm able to say in that micro moment, this actually happened. This is such a silly example, but it happened. We were driving home and my husband said some version of like, hey, I was thinking about rescheduling the event that I planned on Tuesday. And I reacted not gracefully, where I was like, you can't do that. He was like, excuse me? I was like, oh no, I moved heaven and earth to be able to cover for you while you did that event. You better do it. And he was like, okay. So as we paused for a moment, in that moment, I was able to reveal like, wow, I felt really triggered because it felt like all of the effort I'd put into supporting you wasn't being appreciated. And he could say, gosh, I feel really triggered because what I'm realizing is there's actually not enough space in our life. That if you need to move heaven and earth to make something happen, there's a more fundamental question at play. Doing that in the moment kept it from sort of waiting a week where it's like, so a week ago, and I've been storing up all of this stuff. That said, there's a both and. Sometimes you need the longer time.
I mean, that's pretty remarkable that when you're triggered, I mean, I know for me, my emotions are flooded, and it's really hard for me to take that breath and say, oh, I was triggered because of this. Do you have any recommendations for catching yourself when you're triggered or flooded?
It's such a great question. Sometimes there's nothing you can do but just be in the moment and breathe. I think that what you've pointed to is that the awareness, even to say, I'm triggered, is actually in and of itself a profound shift. Because what more often happens is that the triggered emotion, the anger, the frustration, the fear, whatever it is, starts to do the talking, right? So, everyone who's ever had it where the anger does the talking, just even being able to say, wow, I feel triggered, or wow, I feel angry, gives a space where then you can pause and take that deep breath. So, tips, tools, one, any form of grounding or centering or mindfulness practice, I think pays huge dividends in our relationships. So whether that's meditation or prayer or running or, like the mandala coloring books, anything that gives you pause to then have access to your inner observer, I think is a practice that serves you really, really well.
Any suggestions for getting your friend or your partner to do that for themselves?
I think that modeling and invitation is in some ways the best that we can do. Because what I most notice is that all of these things get contagious. So if I'm really triggered and I react out of being triggered, most often I get a triggered response from my partner. Whereas if I start to develop a practice where I take a deep breath or I go for a run in the morning or I practice some other forms of self care, and my partner starts to see, wow, when they come at me with something that is quote unquote triggering, I'm able to hold space better. Often they'll start to go like, wow, that run that you do in the morning, that's kind of paying
Mhm.
off, isn't it? Or like, oh, that journaling that you've been doing, I really notice a difference in you. Or they'll start to ask, what's going on? And that's a really great moment to say
Mm.
something like, hey, I've been intentionally, when I'm triggered, thinking to myself, radical generosity. And that gives me a little bit more space where I can show up for you.
That's a great answer. I'd love for you to talk a little bit about the balance of power in a relationship. I know that historically I've always had kind of a, like when my husband and I first got together, there was a bit of a, I felt like he always had the upper hand until he had a major personal crisis in his life, and it kind of balanced things out, and our relationship became so much healthier afterwards. I'm just wondering if you could share a bit of your research and your observations around the shift of power.
Yeah, it's a really excellent question. So, in relationships where power is at play, there are a couple domains where it pretty reliably will show up. Sometimes power dynamics show up around kind of the home and who's in charge of making the decisions around, for instance, who we spend time with, or what the house looks like, or the activities that the kids are participating in. Sometimes power will show up in money, where a higher earning partner will start to act as though he or she, it's like it's my money instead of our money. And power will often also show up in the bedroom, that the lower drive partner, if there's sort of an interest or a drive mismatch, the lower drive partner ends up being what we found and named the gatekeeper. So those were the three domains that we really saw power most at play. And what we found to be the sort of pro tip, if you will, from couples who had really navigated this with grace is to use structure. So, as a for instance, if finances is the area where power seems to be at play, to have a neutral conversation where you can use a budget to help bring that power into balance. So it feels like these are our decisions about spending or saving rather than your choices. Or, for instance, in the bedroom, there's also a way to use structure that if there's a high drive partner and a low drive partner, they might schedule sex. And while that sounds unsexy, it's actually a huge like relief to both partners to be able to say, it's not going to be like a rejection, sort of ego play when there's an approach or an offer, but rather to say, hey, we know when it's happening so that we can show up for each other. We can even sort of anticipate and plan for. But the general solution is to balance power, use structure.
Is that, you talk in the book about structure and values? Is that along the same lines?
Yeah, so what we're talking about, there's two big pillars in the 80/80 marriage. And we've talked about the first one pretty extensively, that the mindset that you bring to your relationship allows the next piece to be possible. So if in your mindset in your marriage, it's that of radical generosity, right? So the contribution, appreciation, and revealing that we talked about. What that makes possible is a structure of roles, values, priorities, boundaries, power, and sex that then help you feel like you win together as a team. And the first piece that kind of creates the overarching structure for all of those other dimensions are shared values. And it's been really interesting that in our follow up work and the interviews, how many couples would say, gosh, we had a conversation about values when we first started dating, and we never updated that conversation. And what we've really found is that couples in every moment of transition, that's a great time to revisit your values conversation. What are our values for this chapter of our life? And there's no right answer. So there were couples that we talked to. I talked to a couple last week where they were like, hey, for this chapter of our life, it's about service. And so they had left their careers and they were going to go serve in the Peace Corps. There's another couple who is saying, hey, for this chapter of our lives, we're launching businesses, we're creating financial security and stability for ourselves. That's really our primary value. Or for another couple that said, gosh, our kiddos, they're sort of 8, 9, 10. We think that we have another few years where they're still kind of like yummy and mushy. Our priority is creating nuclear family experiences where we really get to love up on each other and build memories for a lifetime. All of those are phenomenal pursuits, but in some ways they're kind of mutually exclusive. You don't go serve in the Peace Corps if you're, trying to create financial stability. And if you're creating those intimate family experiences, it's unlikely you're going to have the freedom, for instance, to sell your belongings and go move to be in a minivan. Maybe,
But wouldn't the value be the overriding objectives or their desires in life, their priorities, so that even if it doesn't mean going to the Peace Corps, you could still incorporate some of those
well,
benefits in your life?
for sure. And I think it's still worth knowing what those key values are so that you're able to get more clear on what you're describing, I think, are the priorities. So the Peace Corps is the action, the
Got
priority
it.
is service. Right now, it's totally possible that I could do service through board work or that I could do service through engagement in a philanthropy that doesn't require me to sort of move to a foreign country. But being really clear about what are we up to? What's our primary value in this chapter of our life creates a bit of a North Star so that other choices like what do we say yes to? What do we say no to? How do we want to organize our roles become easier, not easy, but easier conversations because there's that sort of North Star that you're both pointing toward.
Uh, it- I was thinking about work relationships as well, but someone in the audience has just a comment. It would be nice if there were 80-80 work relationships. That is so true. Like if we were to have conversations around shared values as a team of, that of people that you work with, that would be just amazing.
I think it's a really powerful, there's sort of could 80-80 friendship be next? Maybe. Is the 80-80 workplace next? Maybe. Because exactly to your point, when we know our shared values, that allows us to establish priorities as a team and as an organization, which helps us know what did we say yes to? What did we say no to in terms of, I don't know, geographic expansion or launching a new product line, which then allows us to choose our roles with real clarity. I think that in that 80-80 workplace, the other thing that's foundational is I know tons of organizations where I have done work on, value, mission, strategy, roles, but that foundational piece of are we also engaging with one another from a mindset of radical generosity, where we're thinking about contribution, where we're looking to appreciate, where we're revealing what's going on. I think it creates that sort of the cultural underpinning that takes it from, I don't know, a mechanical exercise that you might do once a quarter into something that can really feel unifying and more generous.
How do you stop going down the rat hole. So say you're in a dialogue and you start scorekeeping. What are some tips for like just shifting gears?
Yeah. Well, so first of all, I would say that's totally normal. Like for heaven's sake, I've co-authored a book about this, and I will catch myself, somehow scorekeeping where I'm like, wait a second, this is my third night in a row of making dinner. And the first tip is just that noticing. I use sort of the interjection of radical generosity. And then the really practical tip is that I go immediately on a scavenger hunt for something to appreciate. So if that's in, a marriage situation, I might recognize like, okay, it's my third night making dinner, but what my husband's doing right now is playing the 28th game of Monopoly Deal in a row. And I would so much rather have a quiet moment cooking than be playing over there. With a colleague, it could be the same thing where there's sort of that sense of like, wait a second, that's not fair, or I'm pulling more weight. And in that moment to see, is there something genuine that you can appreciate about them? And having our brains work in that way, I think, is very significant.
Mm-hmm. We are starting to run out of time. So please, everyone, if you have any questions, put them in the chat and we'll make sure that we'll ask. But there was a question earlier. Can you suggest how to ask good questions to elicit communication from a partner who gets defensive fairly quickly? It's a great question.
That is an excellent question. Thank you for asking that. So if it's a reveal, one of the things that I found really, really helpful is to signal to my partner, we're leaving the realm of sort of regular conversation and I have a reveal. And in some ways, that helps them sort of overstretch toward a space of curiosity and helps them recognize, like, okay, I've got an extra burden of listening here. So signaling that, hey, I have a reveal, and then that helps them sort of know, gosh, let me listen with more curiosity. The other piece that I think can be useful is stating the positive intent behind a question before asking it. So as a, for instance, if I were going to ask my partner, hey, what do you want to do this weekend? And that's a fairly innocuous question, but I'm sort of sensitive that often they hear that question as an accusation. That's like, how come you didn't make plans for us this weekend? Which wasn't my intent. I can preface with, hey, I want to ask you a question about this weekend because I would love to create some time for us to be together, some time for our family to be together, and just a little downtime to decompress from the week. What do you want to do this weekend? Right? But by prefacing with, this is my intention, I can sometimes disarm my partner, especially if they're sort of a little bit sensitive or easily triggered.
Yeah, I sense that they're looking for something.
Right. Yes. Yes. And go ahead.
Well, this is a great question too. How do you know when you go over 80? So it sounds kind of like that's a bit of a giving too much in a relationship.
Yeah.
Or losing yourself.
Yeah, I think that that's really the frame, because in some ways, if I'm striving for exactly 80, I'm sort of back in the trap of sort of measuring and scorekeeping. I think that really one of the primary gifts of living into this space of 80-80 is that I experience myself as whatever I'm doing is a gift to the relationship, and it is in some ways a gift to myself. And if I'm going to do the same activity anyway, so we'll use washing the dishes since that's what I was doing. If I'm going to wash the dishes anyway, I can either wash them from sort of a scorekeeping mentality of, well, it's his turn, or when I cook, I don't make this many dishes for him to wash. But if I do that, I'm sort of bathing myself in cortisol and sort of fanning the flame of resentment. Whereas if I'm striving to do it from generosity, from this mindset of 80-80, then it just allows me to do it as a gift to myself, as a gift to the relationship, and doing the exact same thing. I instead have a moment to just pause or enjoy or just wash the dish, or it's mindfulness, or to appreciate again sort of whatever my partner is doing, like playing Monopoly Deal. You know you've gone too far if it starts to feel like, who am I? Or I'm losing myself, or I'm sort of so interested in and so paying attention to what my partner is up to that I can't find my own goals or desires. In that moment, I think it's a great opportunity for this reveal and request conversation, which might sound something like, hey, I am striving to show up in our relationship with a mindset of radical generosity. I want to be giving to you and to us without any strings attached. And hopefully you noticed, but in case you didn't, I wanted to let you know, because I would love it if you would meet me with some appreciation or some contribution of your own.
That's a great explanation. Thank you. Okay, so a last question is, what parts of the model are still hardest for you in practice?
Yeah, so I think that you actually asked the question differently. The hardest part for me is I find myself in fairness thinking still. And so I'm doing whatever it is that I'm doing, and all of a sudden I'm like, why am I doing this? And I fall back into fairness. And so remembering to cue myself, radical generosity or 80/80 helps me pause and come back to the things that I know actually help me feel much more loving and much more loved in my relationship.
That's really nice. Kaley, thank you so much. You know, in reading it, I think that my relationships overall are going to be better as a result of this, because it really does apply to all relationships in life. So again, thank you so much. Congratulations on the success of your work. It's been really exciting to watch you over the years. I met Kaley like 10 years ago when she was facilitating a conference that I enjoyed so much. So thanks so much, Kaley.
It has been an absolute pleasure speaking with you and with the whole Rebel 11 community. Thank you, everyone.